On a quiet March night in 1932, a nursery in Hopewell, New Jersey, slept under a moonlit hush. By dawn, the crib would be empty, the house full of a mother's heartbeat and a father's ticking nerves. A typed ransom note arrives, chilling in its calm: money for a living child, a warning not to contact the police. The country threads itself around the Lindberghs as a nationwide manhunt unfurls, the largest in American history. But the most shocking moment isn't the note, or the chase, or even the ransom. It's what comes after: a case built on a ladder, a garage critique, a handful of serial numbers, and a verdict that promises certainty while leaving a darker truth barely spoken. This is the story of the Lindbergh kidnapping, what the trial missed. A meticulous crawl through shadows the courtroom glossed over, a journalist's pursuit of the hidden motives, and the uneasy truth that certainty sometimes wears a mask. Context: the location, the victim, and their background. Hopewell, New Jersey isn't a city you'd mistake for the center of the world. It's a quilt of farmland, quiet streets, and a handful of storefronts that feel like they've been stitched into the same fabric for generations. In early 1932, the town, like much of America, moves to a slower, heavier tempo. The Great Depression presses the country, but Hopewell's rhythm is more intimate: the clack of a typewriter in a home office, the scrape of a plow along frostbitten fields, a neighbor's porch light casting a pale rectangle of warmth on a winter night. It's here, on a gentle hillside overlooking meadows and streams, that one of the era's most infamous chapters would unfold, not with a scream from the hills, but with the soft, unnerving silence that follows a family's worst fear. The Lindberghs' life in this place had a gravity all its own. Charles Lindbergh, the aviator who etched his name into history by flying solo from New York to Paris, was no longer simply a figure in headlines. He was a father, a husband, a man who wore fame like a second skin. Anne Morrow Lindbergh, his wife, carried the poise of someone who writes with the precision of a pilot's map and the tenderness of a diary kept in private, not public. They had arrived in Hopewell as a modern family stepping into a rare kind of spotlight, the kind that follows a person home and asks for every room to be kept spotless, every window to bear witness to a life lived under the public gaze. Their child, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., known to friends and family as Charlie, was the sun around which this small orbit pulsed. He was not yet 2 years old, a soft-spoken bundle of dreamlike possibilities, a child who had learned to chase laughter and the sound of a piano with a curiosity that adults often mistake for genius in miniature. He wore the world lightly as toddlers do, with a smile that could light up a room and a stubborn streak that surfaced when he didn't get the cookie his little hands believed were his due. The baby's day-to-day was ordinary in the simplest, most American sense. Meals with a mother's careful cooking, a father's patient stories, a nurse's steady routine, and the kind of quiet rituals that fill a home with a sense of safety and belonging. And yet, within that ordinary frame, a peculiar, almost cinematic brightness clung to the Lindberghs' home. The aviator's fame had a way of turning even the most intimate moments into something that felt watched by a world that didn't sleep. The crib in Charlie's nursery, the window that let in the hush of early spring air, the ladder that would become a chilling symbol in later headlines, these details weren't just architectural quirks of a residence. They were the punctuation marks of a life that was both cherished and scrutinized. In this environment, empathy is earned the hard way, by listening to the way a mother's voice softens when she sings a lullaby, or by noticing the tremor in a father's steady hands when he toggles between fear and reassurance. To measure the emotional weather of the family, you must walk through a day in their home during those months before the storm. The Lindberghs' household was structured, almost methodically so, a blend of high-profile and intimate routine. The aviator, home from flights and interviews, often walked the grounds with a calm that suggested he could outlast any question thrown at him by the press. Anne Morrow, who would later publish works about perception, distance, and the interior life, moved with a quiet intensity that hinted at the emotional intelligence she would bring to motherhood and, later, to the public's fascination with their private agony. Their relationship, enthusiastic, modern, and sometimes quietly formal, was another kind of leadership in the house. It set the emotional weather, even when fear began to insinuate itself into the corners. Charlie's world was a microcosm of a larger national story. He was cherished with a tenderness that one associates with a family's most sacred ritual, the daily life of a child. He learned the shapes of letters before the shapes of numbers, learned to point to things he loved with a toddler's earnest pride, and learned to nap in a room that smelled faintly of wood polish, clean cotton, and the subtle presence of a mother who sang to him in a voice both intimate and protective. In those small rituals, reading aloud a picture book, guiding tiny fingers to solve a puzzle, tucking a blanket around a sleeping child, the reader can feel the tremor of a family anchored in love, even as the larger world outside their door is bending with every new crisis: the economy's squeeze, the political tremors, the relentless 24-hour news cycle that would soon swallow the Lindberghs and leave behind a courtroom's verdict that the world still debates. The community around Hopewell, neighbors, shopkeepers, schoolteachers, and local officials, knew the Lindberghs as people who had conquered distances that most could only dream of crossing. They were a family who did not simply exist within a town's boundaries but carried a kind of mythic aura: the husband who had soared through the air and returned a hero, the wife who spoke softly but with a sharpened intellect, and the child whose every tiny gesture felt like a page turn in a serialized drama the country couldn't stop following. But in a town where the streetlights burned with the same cadence they had for decades, there was also the hum of concern, news that travels in whispers, conversations held in the dim corners of the general store, and a shared sense that the world's eyes might, at any moment, land on this family and demand something fierce and irreversible. If you listened with the ethical ear of a journalist, you heard the underbeat of vulnerability in the Lindberghs' home. Not vulnerability as weakness, but vulnerability as a rare, almost sacred moment when a family's private interior life touches, uncomfortably and irrevocably, the public imagination. The baby's cry, the mother's breath after a lullaby, the father's look of caution when a doorbell rings in the middle of the night, all these ordinary notes would, in time, accumulate into a dissonant chorus that would alter the family's course and the nation's memory forever. The broader social and historical frame matters here too. The United States in 1932 is a nation learning to endure a scale of hardship that is simultaneously economic, political, and cultural. The Lindberghs occupy a particular intersection of glamour and vulnerability in this moment, a symbol of human aspiration, flight, exploration, and the human capacity to cross vast distances, now set against a backdrop of fear, scarcity, and suspicion. The collision of this personal tragedy with the era's mood, where people saved every penny, watched every news broadcast, and whispered about strangers who might have motives hidden behind a charming smile, gave the case its texture. It's not merely the story of a crime. It's a snapshot of a society trying to preserve its sense of safety while admitting that certainty can be a fragile illusion. Empathy, in this context, begins with the most intimate details: the first sounds of Charlie's laughter, the way Anne's handwriting appears in a diary she kept in those weeks, the quiet reassurance Charles laid over the house like a blanket, an attempt to guard a family against the tremors of a world that seemed to tilt at the wrong moments. It's the tender, almost clinical precision with which a mother and father cherished their child, the child who slept in a nursery with a view of the winter sky, the child who would one day become a symbol of both American ingenuity and the fragility of human trust. The crime itself. The night is unusually quiet in Hopewell, as if the town itself is holding its breath. Inside the Lindbergh home, the nursery sits on the second floor like a small fortress of soft colors and imagined promises. Charlie Lindbergh, a baby with a thunderstorm of curls and a laugh that could melt stone, is asleep in his crib, the nightlight of a thin halo around his tiny figure. Anne sits nearby, the book she's been nursing for the 100th time resting in her lap, while Charles roams the perimeter of their quiet life with a conductor's patience. The typewriters clack a distant metronome to a world that expects certainty from a family that has already lived under the glare of destiny. Then a shift in the air, an absence that feels almost physical. The house, which has carried the hum of a family's ordinary rituals, an evening song, a nurse's soft steps, the careful cadence of a father returning from the airport, seems to lean toward unease. The clock on the mantel ticks louder as if it, too, senses the weight of something unsaid. A window is closed, the nursery door stands a touch too firm, and Charlie's breath, once a predictable purple with each gentle exhale, betrays nothing but the stillness of a sleep that isn't quite natural. It begins with a single moment of silence that stretches too long. The nurse's routine checks, picks up a dropped toy, adjusts the blanket, whispers a lullaby, fall away into a vacuum of time. The crib, once a cradle of trust, becomes the stage for a crime that would feel improbable in a world where the extraordinary is meant to protect the innocent. The first sign that something is wrong is not a scream but a hollow hush, the kind of hush that makes you listen twice, then thrice, as if your ears themselves are trying to reconstruct a scene that no longer fits the daylight. The crime itself unfolds with a cruel economy of effort. A window on the nursery wall, a second-story reach, a ladder, the instrument that will become the quiet, chilling symbol of the crime. The ladder is not presented as a weapon in a melodrama. It is a tool, ordinary in the hands of a carpenter or a neighbor who uses it to hang a picture or mend a roof. Yet in the hands of a kidnapper, it becomes a conduit between the safety of a sleeping child and the unknown outside world. The ladder is placed in order, its top rung resting against the window frame, the bottom end hidden in the shadows of the yard, as if the night itself conspired to keep the plan concealed until the final, irreversible moment. When the intrusion occurs, there is almost no sound, an almost respectful, clinical quiet that allows the room to bear witness to a crime it cannot comprehend. The crib's side rail is breached, a space where Charlie's small presence could not possibly be a threat to the world so large that it would soon hold a national gaze. The notes begin to tell the story, appearing like a ledger entry written in haste, the kind of communication that reveals more about the person who writes than the person who disappears. A ransom note, clipped from a page and typed with a precision that suggests a meticulous, almost forensic intent, is left on the nursery windowsill. The message is chilling in its civility, a demand for money, a deadline, a warning against police, and a claim that the child would be returned if the terms are met. It is not a scream, but a confession couched in policy, a confession that there is a plan in motion and a price attached to a life. The immediate aftermath is a theater of reactions rather than a single, definitive moment. Anne's voice, ordinarily a steady instrument of calm, fractures into a tremor that speaks of a mother's primal fear and a wife's instinct to protect. Charles, who has spent a lifetime learning to read the sky and the breath of his own fame, becomes a different version of himself, not the aviator who can cross continents in a single night, but a father navigating the fragile line between courage and helplessness. The house becomes a map of each person's reaction to the unknown, the way a fingerprint can tell you more about a person than a name can if you know how to read it. Outside the front doors, the world begins to wake up. Neighbors who had once read the Lindberghs as legends now read them as humans pressed to a limit they never anticipated. Local officials, reporters, and volunteers file into Hopewell with the kind of earnest energy that is both admirable and dangerous. It can rally a community or distort a truth under the pressure of speed. The search teams move through the township with a sense of mission that is earnest but not immune to speculation. The country, still reeling from the Great Depression, turns its attention to a household that represents a paradox, a symbol of national achievement and a chest of private fears that clang loudly when the door closes at night. If you were to step back and peer into the room as a reader might a crime scene photo, you'd notice small, telling things: the careful arrangement of Charlie's blankets, the way the nurse's station sign still flickers in the corner, the chalk marks on the floor that a nervous hand traced in an attempt to preserve what remains of a night that should have been ordinary. The ladder's mark remains on the lawn, a pale imprint of an act that would demand a nation's response. The ransom note's handwriting, typed, precise, almost clinical, offers its own kind of motive, a desire for power, control, and public drama, a way to answer the question that haunts any parent who has ever felt the blunt force of fate: how much is a child worth in a country that measures success in headlines? What unfolds in the hours and days after Charlie's disappearance is less a single narrative than a branching maze of questions. Who could have taken him, and why? How could the crime be executed with such apparent ease in a home that seemed impervious to intrusion? What does the note reveal about the person who wrote it? Someone with access to a typewriter, a quiet ambition, and a willingness to gamble with life itself. And perhaps most troubling, What corner of the adult psyche would permit a plan so cold, so meticulously structured, that even the most protective institutions of a modern, highly visible family could be forced to admit they were, in some essential way, unprepared? The crime, in its stark literal sense, is simple. A child is abducted from a family's private space, and a ransom is demanded, a price attached to a life. But the deeper truth, the truth the trial would only partially illuminate, the truth this investigation will chase with renewed intensity, concerns motive, opportunity, and the fragile line between heroism and paranoia that can tilt in a heartbeat. The investigation process: clues, suspects, red herrings, breakthroughs. The moment Charlie disappeared, the ledger in Hopewell didn't close. It opened in a flurry of ink and urgency. The investigation didn't follow a neat line from clue to conclusion. It zigzagged through false starts, whispered theories, and the stubborn insistence that there must be a rational map behind the incomprehensible crime. What follows is a dossier of the era's most publicized inquiry, told with the same appetite for detail and the same hunger for what the courtroom would later miss. Clues that forced a closer look. The ladder and the window breach. The kidnapper didn't break in through a perfect storm of violence. They used something ordinary and practical: a ladder, a window, a precise climb. The ladder, found leaning against the nursery wall, becomes a recurring symbol. A simple tool that becomes the conduit between safety and fear. Its construction, its measurements, and where it disappeared into the night would haunt investigators as they tried to reconstruct an act that seemed almost mechanical in its efficiency. The ransom note, written with chilling civility. A note left in Charlie's nursery spoke with the cadence of a policy memo rather than a butcher's malice. It demanded money, warned against police, and set a clock that would become a national drumbeat. The tone suggested a writer who understood legal and financial systems, who could thread threat with restraint. The note was examined for typographical quirks, the specific keyboard patterns, even the typewriter's brand and model, details that might connect the hand to a breaker of trust, not just a thief. The money and its trail. The interplay of payment and pressure, the ransom of $50,000, became the financial fingerprint of the crime. Investigators chased serial numbers, bank records, and the strange possibility that someone with access to a banking trail knew how to move funds without triggering immediate scrutiny. The money's movement pointed toward a focal point where motive, opportunity, and opportunity's dark twin, calculated risk, could meet. The note's sender profile. The typed note carried more than a demand. It carried a narrative about control. The handwriting hints, the choice of words, the rhythm of the message, these became clues about the personality behind the crime. For investigators, decoding the sender's profile was almost as important as recovering Charlie himself. The setting's fingerprints. Hopewell's quiet streets, the Lindbergh home's architecture, and the period's supply chains are all offered context. The investigators didn't just collect physical evidence. They collected the surrounding data: who had access to the Lindberghs, who could have watched their routine, who might have hidden within the subtle vulnerabilities of a high-profile family during a national crisis. Suspects, red herrings, and the long shadow of motive. Bruno Richard Hauptmann, the carpenter with a chance alignment. Hauptmann has become the most enduring figure in the story not only because he was convicted, but because his background, an outsider with practical skills, a knack for careful work, and a life lived on the margins of a country rebuilding trust, fit the crime's silhouette. He owned tools and a workshop that could plausibly produce a ladder and a hideaway space. The case against him hinged on material links. Would matching the ladder, notes and transactions that implied someone with mechanical skill and an eye for detail. The intermediary becomes a mirror, Jaffe. John Condon, the self-styled middleman who stepped into the public eye and claimed a role in coordinating communications between the Lindberghs and the kidnapper, added a human layer to the investigation's complexity. Was he a genuine go-between or a catalyst who amplified fear and unforgiving timelines? The Jaffe persona introduced a persistent question: who was manipulating whom, and to what end? A spectrum of likely culprits and plausible distractions. Early whispers drifted toward a wider pool: other locals with access to the home's perimeters, contractors who had worked on nearby property, and even individuals drawn to the family's notoriety for reasons not entirely linked to Charlie's disappearance. Red herrings multiplied, rumors about alibis that crumbled under cross-examination, misread behaviors that looked guilty in the glare of pushy media coverage, and a public fixation that sometimes mistook posture for evidence. The quiet, domestic shadows. The emotional landscape of the investigation was not merely about who took Charlie, but who might have planned such an act in a life that looked like it had been created to withstand fame, not to be undone by a single night. Investigators learned to listen for the tremor in voices when they talked about Charlie, and to read the tension in households that had grown used to cameras in their windows. Breakthroughs, misdirections, and the turning points. The attic and the woodwork discovery. A breakthrough, often the most unglamorous in any true crime narrative, emerged from a search of Hauptmann's surroundings. A stash of wood shavings, a ladder fragment, and wood that could be traced to the same type as the famous ladder. The forensic hinge was not a dazzling fingerprint, but a cross-reference. The timber species, its origin, its aging marks, and the way it had been cut. It wasn't a slam-dunk revelation, but it was a weighty step toward connecting a man to a scene that belonged to a boy's final moments. The ransom money trace. Investigators pressed the serial numbers on the ransom bills. The idea wasn't just to recover money, but to map how it might have moved, who could legally possess that bill, and how someone operating on the fringe of legality might have used or discarded a portion of wealth acquired through a crime. The money's path suggested patterns of use, ownership, and opportunity that began to tilt suspicion toward a figure who operated in small circles of craftsmanship and local commerce. The confession of a motive and opportunity. Motive in this case wasn't a single, cinematic flame. It was a slow-burning mix of desperation, pride, and a practical, almost mechanical desire to alter a family's public image. The more investigators teased apart the suspect's opportunities, where they could have learned the Lindbergh's routines, how they could have approached the nursery, and where a tool from a workshop might be procured, the more the puzzle began to align, piece by stubborn piece. The courtroom becomes a crucible. As the evidence coalesced into a prosecutable theory, the courtroom transformed into a stage where the case's logical weaknesses were pressed into the light. The defense sought doubt in the chain of custody, the reliability of the locksmithing tools, and the filmic memory of a crime that felt almost mythic in its implications. The prosecution countered with the weight of physical links, the ladder's material, the wood's provenance, and the strategic fit of Hauptmann's presence around the perimeters of the crime's timeline. The human element, motive, fear, and the culture of certainty. The investigators' inner lives. The detectives and agents weren't just logical engines. They carried the emotional residue of a national crisis. Every taped interview, every cross-examination, every night spent at a desk with a map and a string connected to a pin felt like a small battle against terror, the fear that a child could vanish from a cradle in a house that didn't belong to the world's safety, only to be found later in a way that might never satisfy the heart of a parent. The Lindbergh's private agony. The investigation didn't only document clues, it recorded the tremor of a couple under relentless public glare. The emotional weather, hope, skepticism, anxiety, and a stubborn willingness to believe colored every conversation, every press briefing, and every decision about how to respond to tips that sometimes sounded like whispers from strangers. The community's moral calculus. Hopewell's neighbors and the nation's readers watched as the story unfolded. Some found in this tragedy a rallying cry for perseverance. Others saw a cautionary tale about sensationalism and the temptation to read motive into every gesture. The investigation, in turn, had to navigate a line between public interest and private suffering, between the need to deliver truth and the risk of amplifying fear. Twists, tests, and the arc toward a contested truth. A case built on multiple plausible narratives. The investigation didn't produce a single, clean culprit with an airtight trail. It produced a scenario in which a handful of elements could converge to point in one direction while still leaving room for doubt. The strongest testimony wasn't a solitary fact but a cluster of correlations: the wood's origin, the ladder's construction, the note's typographical hallmarks, and Hauptmann's proximity to the era's labor and transit networks. The public's appetite for certainty. The Lindbergh case tested a nation's desire for closure against the messy reality of forensic and circumstantial evidence. In a society hungry for a verdict, the line between what could be proved and what could be inferred often blurred, and the courtroom's verdict, whatever its faults, would leave a lasting imprint on how future crimes were investigated and discussed. The turning point that wasn't the end. The investigation's most enduring turning point wasn't a dramatic courtroom confession, but a convergence of physical evidence, juried interpretation, and prosecutorial strategy that culminated in a conviction that history would scrutinize for decades. It's a reminder that in cases like this, certainty often arrives wearing the face of a verdict while still leaving the full truth with a shade too murky for perfect memory. The courtroom focus, twists, testimony, and the deeper psychology of a nation's trial. The courtroom becomes the stage for the country's most intimate fear, that certainty can rest on a thread, and that a man's fate can hinge on the persuasive shape of a narrative. Step 5 leans into the balance of evidence and perception, the choreography of cross-examination, and the unseen gears grinding in the minds of those who lived inside the room as history was being written. Opening act. The courtroom as a theater of belief. The setting. Flemington's courthouse glints under the glare of press photographers and the slow march of loyal, anxious onlookers. The air is heavy with the echo of previous headlines, with a public hunger that makes every gesture feel loaded, every quiet moment a potential confession. The judge presides with formality that feels almost ceremonial, as if the room aims to preserve a sense of civility even as lives are weighed. The prosecution speaks in the measured cadence of a man who believes the case rests on more than anecdotes, on the confluence of tangible links. The ladder, the wood, the serial numbers, and the pattern of an amateurish but determined criminal mind. The defense counters with a posture of doubt, insisting that the state's case is a spiderweb of coincidences, not a chain of causation. A cast of minds, who's in the box? Bruno Richard Hauptmann, the central enigma. Psychology in play. Hauptmann presents as quiet, meticulous, and inward. He's a man who has learned to survive by keeping his thoughts close, offering little in the way of emotional weather. In the courtroom, his demeanor is studied, almost mathematical. He seems to weigh every remark against a private ledger of consequences. The defense will argue that he's a craftsman who happened to cross paths with a crime that used his tools as props, not as a conductor's baton. The prosecution argues that his craft, access to wood, and proximity to the crime's perimeters establish a plausible, if contested, causal chain. Charles Lindbergh, the father as a patient analyst of danger. Psychology in play. Lindbergh is a paradox, a man who has flown above risk yet now finds himself compelled to walk through it step by step. In the courtroom, he is precise, controlled, and fiercely rational. His presence steadies a public memory that risks dissolving into myth. His reactions, measured, sometimes guarded, offer a window into a man who has learned to endure storms without surrendering his own moral compass. He embodies the tension between public hero and private parent who understands that life's most unbearable moments demand a careful, almost clinical calculation of what truth demands in the face of fear. And Mauro Lindbergh, the interior witness. Psychology in play, and speaks with a calm that feels both intimate and calculated. She's a woman who has seen the edge where perception becomes truth and truth becomes a weapon. In the courtroom, her presence acts as a counterweight to the public's hunger for spectacle, reminding the room that grief can be as singular as a fingerprint, unrepeatable and deeply personal. Her psyche, a blend of vulnerability and disciplined endurance, offers a portrait of a partner who bears the weight of a family's shipwreck and still finds a way to keep the beacon lit. John Condon, Jaffe, the intermediary as psychology in motion. Psychology in play. Jaffe's persona, bold, almost theatrical, reflects a man who believed he could bridge two worlds, the lay public's fear and the kidnapper's cold calculus. In court, his testimony becomes a thread that could either connect the dots or unravel them, depending on who holds the thread and how tightly they pull. He represents the public's desire to be guided by a figure who speaks with both paternal authority and a journalist's curiosity. His behavior, ambitious, hopeful, sometimes self-regarding, exposes how the line between aid and manipulation can blur under the pressure of a national crisis. The prosecutor and the defense attorney, two minds, two moral weather systems. Psychology in play. The prosecutor embodies the nation's insistence that a crime of such scale deserves a rational, prosecutable answer. He carries the weight of the theory of the case, as a trust placed in him by a country hungry for closure. The defense, conversely, operates as a counterweight to certainty. They insist that human memory, chance alignments, and garden-variety misinterpretations must be acknowledged, and that a verdict grounded in assumptions risks a moral error. Their rhetoric, their pacing, and their cross-examinations reveal not only legal strategies but competing worldviews about how truth should be pursued and how guilt should be proven. The heart of the courtroom drama, a series of revealing close-ups. The ladder and the wood, tangible ties versus interpretive leaps. The prosecution presses the ladder's origin, the type of wood, the marks that could be traced to a workshop, and a worker's proximity to a crime that required such tools. The defense challenges each link, asking for the margins where misinterpretation could live, the possibility that similar wood exists in dozens of shops or that a craftsman's routine could be misread as a crime's blueprint. The ransom notes and the typist's fingerprint on guilt. The typist's technique becomes a precision instrument in the state's case. The defense argues that matching a typewriter and stylistic quirks is a probabilistic claim, not a proof of culpability. The courtroom becomes an anatomy lesson in language as evidence, the idea that control over a keyboard can translate into control over a victim, and thus into a motive, gets weighed against the possibility of coincidence or shared cultural context. The money trail as a moral compass. The serial number chase is not just finance, it's a narrative about opportunity, habit, and the social ecology of crime. The prosecutor will paint a picture of a man who navigated the cash economy with a craftsman's ease, leaving a breadcrumb trail that, when followed, points toward Hauptmann. The defense will push back, asking whether the path is too neat, too clean, too susceptible to selective memory or misinterpretation. The motive versus opportunity debate. The courtroom becomes a debate about human psychology as much as physical science. Was there a concrete motive, economic desperation, social alienation, or a desire to claim a broader, almost mythic power over a famous family? Or was motive merely a stylized construction that allowed observers to read meaning into a night that was messy, contingent, and contingent on chance? Twists that shift the axis of belief. The confession that never fully resolves. The defense might evoke doubt by underscoring that Hauptmann's statements, while consistent with some elements of the timeline, leave gaps that rationally could be filled by others. In a trial built on circumstantial threads, a single alternative narrative can tilt a juror's mind toward reasonable doubt, even if the sum still leans toward guilt. The certainty of certainty, media and memory. The courtroom isn't immune to the spectacle outside its doors. The press's fixation can alter jurors' perceptions, and the public's belief, once seated, can bloom into a second, separate truth, the one more powerful than the one in the courtroom. The trial reveals how memory, once shaped by headlines, can become part of the evidence itself. The counter-narratives that endure. Even after a verdict, the psychological landscape remains unsettled. Some jurors face their own moral ambiguity. Some audience members carry forward a lingering suspicion that the tragedy's full truth remains obscured by the limits of the era's forensic science and by the courtroom's need to render a verdict. The verdict, the punishment, and the aftershocks. The conviction and the death sentence. Hauptmann's jury delivers a verdict that resonates beyond the courtroom walls. The punishment of a man whose life is measured not just in years but in the weight of public memory. The sentence is designed to reflect the severity of depriving a child of life, while also sending a message about how a society answers with law when fear becomes the default currency of the era. The post-trial controversies. Critics argue that the case rested on a mosaic of plausible inferences rather than a singular, incontrovertible chain of evidence. Supporters claim that the jury's responsibilities required a high threshold of certainty and that Hauptmann's proximity to the crime's physical characteristics and his place in the local economy provided sufficient linkage under the standards of the time. The truth, as many historians would note, lies in the tension between those poles. The broader impact on justice and media. The trial catalyzed reforms and new legal tools, most notably the Lindbergh Law, the federalization of kidnapping cases to address the threat that cross-border crime posed to national security and public safety. The courtroom drama thus becomes a hinge. It reshapes how law, media, and popular culture frame crime forever after. The human afterward. Psychology in the margins. The investigator's cognitive load. The lawyers, jurors, and investigators carry the emotional residue of the case long after the verdict. The cognitive load of repeatedly revisiting a child's disappearance, through the prism of a courtroom's disciplined logic, produces both resilience and fatigue, shaping how future cases would be approached and argued. The Lindbergh's private clarity in a legalized tragedy. For the family, the trial is both a public proceeding and a private reckoning, a moment when a couple's private life is audited by the world, and where the line between faith in the system and personal doubt becomes a living tension. The audience's memory. The public's memory fractures into competing narratives. Some remember Hauptmann as the man who did it, others as the scapegoat of a media storm, and still others as the hinge point where a country's hunger for certainty redefined justice. The truth becomes not a single entity but a spectrum of interpretations that continue to inform how we think about crime, guilt, and accountability. Closing note: the unresolved thread and the ongoing inquiry. The resolution that endures is not merely a legal sentence but a cultural one, a reminder that a courtroom, while capable of delivering a verdict, cannot always lock away the complexity of human action, the fragility of memory, or the imperfect science of deduction. The Lindbergh case remains a touchstone for debates about evidence, motive, and how societies want to understand harm when certainty is so desirable.